My name is Alexis Warner, and I represent the appellant in this case, Candyland. Today, this court should reverse the holding of the district court that allowed the inclusion of obesity without an underlying physiological cause as an impairment under the Americans with Disabilities Act. This court should reverse this holding for 4 reasons. First, the legislative materials indicate that the legislative intent was to exclude this type of obesity. Second, other courts have ruled that obesity requires an underlying physiological cause in order to be deemed an impairment under the ADA. Third, cases that have ruled that obesity does not require an underlying physiological cause are distinguished from the case at hand. And lastly, including this type of obesity as an impairment would expand the class of litigants to such an extent that it would overrun the courts. On June 18, 2014, the appellee visited Candyland and attempted to ride 2 separate rides that she was unable to ride because of her size. The appellee is 5'7" and weighs 225 pounds. She is 20% higher than the ideal body weight, and she is classified by her physician as obese but not severely obese. There is no medical indicator that she needs to be at the weight where she is, and she has no underlying physiological cause for her obesity. The first reason why this court should exclude obesity without an underlying physiological cause as an impairment is because the legislative intent of the ADA was to exclude this type of obesity. The statute was only intended to cover those truly in need of governmental assistance to prevent discrimination. The court in Francis v. City of Meriden said it very well when they said that the ADA is intended, quote, to assure that truly disabled individuals will not face discrimination because of stereotypes about the insurmountability of handicaps. It would debase this high purpose if the statutory protections available to those truly handicapped would be claimed by anyone whose disability was minor and whose relative severity of impairment was widely shared. The intent of the legislature enumerated in the statute is, quote, to provide clear, strong, consistent, enforceable standards addressing discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Including this standard actually makes a murky standard because there are lots of people that could be included in this kind of impairment without an underlying physiological cause. And so it actually creates a murkier standard to open the doors to this broad class of litigants. It creates a clearer standard to exclude this type of obesity altogether and go with obesity that requires an underlying physiological cause.
But what about morbid obesity? It's just a clear standard. A doctor comes in, he says he or she's morbidly obese. They are or they aren't. It's like an on-off switch. Why isn't that just a sufficiently clear line?
Yes, Your Honor. That standard is actually a standard that we believe should be the standard. There are several courts that have ruled that obesity does require an underlying physiological cause if it is morbidly obese. And in fact, cases that have ruled that obesity does not require an underlying physiological cause are distinguished from the case at hand because those require severe obesity and morbid obesity. Several cases appear to be distinguished from the case at hand and are distinguished from the case at hand because of that line drawn between severe obesity and morbid obesity. In Resources for Human Development Incorporated, the court said, quote, if a charging party's weight is outside the normal range, that is, if the charging party is severely obese, there is no explicit requirement that obesity be based on a physiological impairment. And several other courts have made that same distinction, that even though it has no underlying physiological cause, it is severely obese or morbidly obese, and that is where the standard should be drawn, if there is to be no underlying physiological cause. However, if it is to be just obese, there should be an underlying physiological cause attached with it.
So can I just clarify, what you're saying is obesity plus underlying physiological cause equals sufficient and morbidly obese equals sufficient?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Several courts have held that to be the case. And several courts have agreed that obesity, just obesity, not severely or morbidly, requires an underlying physiological cause. The second Circuit, or the Sixth Circuit in EEOC versus Watkins Motor Lines Incorporated said, quote, to constitute an ADO impairment, a person's obesity, even morbid obesity, must be the result of a physiological impairment. And the Second Circuit said in Francis versus City of Meriden, quote, obesity, except in special cases where the obesity relates to a physiological disorder, is not a physical impairment within the meaning of the ADA. And several lower courts have found the same. In EEOC versus Texas Bus Lines, the court concluded that even morbid obesity is not a disability under the ADA unless it is accompanied by a physiological condition. And the court held in Mercer versus Miami-Dade County that, which is an analogous case because the court in that instance said that the county was not required to provide proper fitting accommodations to the plaintiff because the plaintiff did not have an underlying physiological cause to her obesity. She was not able to fit in the bus seats because she was obese, but the court said that that was not enough. She required an underlying physiological cause. And so this court should rule in the same way because the facts are very analogous. The ADA should be interpreted in conjunction with the amendments, as it further illustrates the legislative intent. The legislature felt that the amendments were necessary in order to rectify the excessive narrowing that the Supreme Court had done with a couple of its court decisions, and they had narrowed the scope of the ADA past what the legislature had intended. However, that does not affect the cases decided after the ADA here, or after the amendments here, because the amendments were intended to rectify those cases that narrowed only the latter two elements of disability, substantially limiting of a major life activity. At issue here is the definition of impairment, and conspicuously absent from the enumerated purposes of the amendments is any mention of the definition of impairment. And given the extensive edits to the ADA in the amendments, if the legislator had intended to exclude or include this kind of obesity, it would have addressed impairment and the pre-amendment cases precluding obesity without an underlying physiological cause.
So, Counselor, even post the amendment, though, courts have interpreted obesity to be an impairment, despite the definition not changing, correct?
Correct. However, Your Honor, most of those cases, in fact, those cases did address the other two elements of obesity, or I'm sorry, excuse me, the other two elements of disability, substantially limiting and affecting major life activity. But the case at hand deals with the definition of impairment, which is not addressed in the changes to the ADA via the amendments.
Can I ask you a question about, I understand your test now. Do you win under your test, though? Because I read the record as saying there's a possibility here that she might actually have been morbidly obese. And didn't the district court find that she satisfied the standard? So can we really know what they based that off of?
Your Honor, her obesity is actually, according to her physician, it is right on the line of being severely obese or just morbid or just obese. However, she is actually classified as just obese, and this court must, according with the ADA amendments, must actually keep with the standard of keeping a clear and enforceable standard. And so in order to do that, this court must draw a line distinctly between obesity and severely obese. Because if she is allowed to kind of waver between the two standards, that is not sufficient because there's not a clear standard there if she could kind of go with both. So it actually provides a clearer standard to make a hard drawn line using the BMI factor. Lastly, this type of obesity should be excluded because it will overrun the courts if the class of litigants is expanded to include all obese litigants.
Counsel, isn't our focus though on the disability rather than a problem that might arise to the court? I mean, if we look back at the history of the legislation, it was enacted with the idea that we were going to put disabled people on a level playing field. And your argument just seems to contradict what is the legislative intent.
Your Honor, I see that my time is up. May I have a brief moment to answer your question
Yes.
quickly? The legislative intent, yes, by the ADA was actually intended to broaden the class of litigants that the Supreme Court decisions had narrowed. However, that is beyond what the scope of the actual ADA intended. The ADA did not intend to include the class of obese litigants, which would be approximately 78.6 million Americans, which is far beyond what the ADA intended to include. So, for the foregoing reasons, the appellant respectfully requests that this court reverse the holding of the district court that allowed the inclusion of obesity without an underlying physiological cause as an impairment. Thank you.